An undercover cop infiltrates a ruthless cartel to avenge his brother's death. But as he manipulates alliances and triggers betrayals, he finds himself questioning, will he destroy the gang or become the very monster he's fighting? Javier Roldan adjusted the earpiece as he stepped into the shadowy alley. The city loomed around him, its towering buildings casting jagged silhouettes against a faint, polluted sky. Neon lights flickered, struggling to pierce through the perpetual haze that clung to every corner of this urban labyrinth. This was his hunting ground, a place that had consumed many and spat out only the ruthless. The sound of his own heartbeat filled his ears as he approached the meeting point. His instructions were clear: gain Diego El Fenix's trust and infiltrate the gang that had turned the city into its personal battlefield. Yet tonight, the weight of his mission pressed harder than usual. Javier clenched his fists, feeling the ghost of a memory flash through his mind. His younger brother, gone too soon, a victim of the drugs peddled by this same gang. It was personal. He needed this to succeed, not just for justice, but for closure. He glanced at the time, 11:47 p.m. They would be here soon. The alley smelled of decay and damp concrete, a perfect backdrop for the poison that spread from here to the city's veins. A van pulled up, its tires crunching over loose gravel. Javier's jaw tightened. 3 figures stepped out. Diego himself, flanked by 2 of his enforcers. The man was unmistakable, with a tattoo of a phoenix sprawling across his neck, its wings disappearing beneath his shirt. "You're late," Diego said, his voice low and menacing. "Had to make sure I wasn't followed," Javier replied, keeping his tone casual but respectful. The truth was, he had rehearsed this meeting 100 times in his head. One wrong word, one misplaced gesture, and he would be a dead man. Diego studied him, his dark eyes piercing. "You've got the money?" Javier nodded, producing a briefcase. Inside were marked bills. Bait in this elaborate trap to lure Diego into a larger sting operation. Diego motioned to one of his men, who took the case and began inspecting its contents. A tense silence stretched between them until, without warning, Diego's expression shifted. "This feels off," Diego muttered. He snapped his fingers, and the enforcers moved faster than Javier could react. One of them pinned his arms while the other struck him hard across the face. The earpiece fell to the ground with a tiny crack. Javier cursed under his breath. The backup team wouldn't hear a thing now. "Who sent you?" Diego's voice was a growl. Javier spat blood, feigning innocence. "I'm here for business." "You're paranoid." Diego smirked, but his eyes remained cold. "Paranoia keeps me alive. Bring him." Javier struggled, but it was futile. They dragged him toward the van, his mind racing for an escape. As the vehicle doors slammed shut, he realized this was far from the controlled operation he had envisioned. The city lights blurred through the windows as the van sped away. Javier's mission to bring down Diego's empire had just become a desperate fight for survival. Javier awoke to the dull throb of pain radiating from his jaw and ribs. His head felt heavy and his vision blurred as he blinked against the dim light filtering through a single cracked bulb overhead. Chains rattled when he tried to move, sending a jolt of cold reality through his body. He was bound to a steel support beam in what appeared to be a forgotten warehouse. The air was damp and reeked of oil, rust, and mildew. Stacks of decaying wooden crates lined the walls, and broken machinery lay discarded in corners. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, accompanied by faint murmurs. Javier forced himself to focus. He wasn't dead, which meant he still had a chance, no matter how slim, to turn this situation around. But first, he needed to understand where he was and who he was dealing with. The gang members were in view now, their figures illuminated by the pale light. Diego stood at the center, radiating authority. The tattoo on his neck seemed almost alive in the flickering glow. To his right was Camilla, her sharp features framed by a curtain of dark hair. She carried herself with an air of calculated confidence, her arms crossed as she observed the scene with a faint smirk. To Diego's left was Miguel, a hulking man with a shaved head and a permanent scowl etched onto his face. He leaned against the wall, flipping a knife between his fingers with unsettling ease. "Wake him," Diego ordered. Miguel stepped forward and delivered a swift kick to Javier's leg, jolting him upright. Javier groaned but forced himself to lock eyes with Diego. "So," Diego began, his voice calm but laced with menace, "you think you can just walk into my operation without consequences?" I told you, Javier said, his voice hoarse. I'm just a guy trying to make a deal. Diego crouched in front of him, studying his face. Maybe, but I don't trust anyone, not even the people I've worked with for years. He glanced at Camila, who nodded slightly. Then why keep me alive? Javier asked, testing the waters. Diego chuckled, rising to his feet. Because every rat has its use. Maybe you'll prove useful, or maybe you'll prove entertaining. The room burst into laughter, but Javier's focus wasn't on the taunts. It was on their dynamics. Camila's subtle eye roll at Diego's joke, Miguel's overeager chuckle, and Diego's self-assured grin. There was tension here, fractures beneath the surface. Keep him here, Diego instructed, before walking toward the exit. Camila, you're in charge. Make sure he doesn't try anything stupid. As Diego disappeared into the shadows, Camila exchanged a glance with Miguel. I'll handle this, she said sharply, silencing any protest. Javier slumped against the beam, feigning defeat. But inside, his mind worked tirelessly. He'd observed enough to know that these weren't just criminals. They were people with egos, insecurities, and ambitions. If he played his cards right, those cracks could become his escape. For now, all he could do was wait and watch. Javier sat motionless, his body still aching from the earlier beating, but his mind sharp. Hours had passed since Diego left, and the warehouse had settled into a tense quiet. Camila stood near a table, scrolling through her phone, while Miguel lingered nearby, sharpening his blade with deliberate slowness. The silence between them felt charged, like a storm waiting to break. Javier had noticed the subtle power dynamics in their earlier interactions. Camila's assertiveness clashed with Miguel's need to assert dominance, while Diego maintained a tenuous grip over them both. If he wanted to survive, he needed to exploit those cracks. He shifted slightly, letting the chains rattle just enough to draw attention. You've got that look, he said, his voice raspy but audible. Camila glanced up, her brow furrowing. What look? Javier smirked faintly. The look of someone who's tired of being second best. Miguel stepped forward, the knife glinting in his hand. Shut your mouth, rat, or I'll shut it for you. Javier raised his hands defensively, the chains clinking. Hey, just making an observation. No need to get touchy. He turned his gaze to Camila. But I can see why he's nervous. A smart woman like you? That's gotta be threatening. Camila tilted her head, curiosity flickering behind her guarded expression. What are you trying to say? Nothing you don't already know, Javier said, leaning back against the beam. Diego doesn't trust anyone, not even his closest allies. And Miguel here? He's too busy playing attack dog to see the bigger picture. Enough, Miguel barked, lunging forward and gripping Javier by the collar. You think you're clever, huh? You're nothing but a pawn. Javier didn't flinch, meeting Miguel's glare with calm defiance. Maybe, but pawns can change the game when the players aren't paying attention. Miguel shoved him back against the beam with a grunt, but Javier caught the flicker of doubt in his eyes. It was a seed, small but planted. Later, when Miguel stepped outside for a smoke, Camila lingered near Javier. He seized the opportunity. You know he doesn't respect you, Javier said softly. Camila turned sharply, her eyes narrowing. And why should I care what you think? You shouldn't, Javier admitted, his tone measured. But you're smarter than him. Smarter than Diego even. The way you handle things, you're the one keeping this gang afloat. You deserve better. She studied him, her expression unreadable, but she didn't walk away. Javier knew he was treading a fine line. Camila wasn't just an ambitious strategist, she was also loyal, to a point. If he pushed too hard, he could lose her. Instead, he shifted the conversation. Word of advice, watch Miguel. He doesn't like competition. Camila scoffed but didn't deny it. She turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing in the warehouse. Javier let out a quiet breath. He had sown the first seeds of discord. Now all he had to do was wait for them to grow. The metallic creak of the warehouse doors jolted Javier awake. His muscles ached and the cold of the chains bit into his wrists. Diego entered, flanked by Camila and Miguel. Behind them, two more gang members carried a battered wooden crate that they set down with a resounding thud. Time for some fun, Diego announced, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. Let's see what you're really made of, rat. Javier straightened against the beam, masking his apprehension. He had expected a test, but the specifics remained a mystery. The crate was pried open, revealing a jumbled assortment of items: knives, a gun with an empty magazine, and a half-broken crowbar. Diego paced, his phoenix tattoo shifting with every movement. You've been talking big. Let's see if you're as useful as you claim. Miguel, bring him. Miguel smirked, pulling Javier to his feet with a rough yank. Javier stumbled but kept his footing, his mind racing to assess his options. You see that? Diego pointed to a steel door at the far end of the warehouse. Behind it is a man who owes me money. He thought he could disappear, but we found him. Your job is to teach him a lesson. Javier's stomach turned. He had no idea who this man was, but one thing was clear. Diego wanted blood. What happens if I refuse? Javier asked, keeping his voice steady. Diego's smile was cold. Then Miguel will teach you a lesson instead. Javier's eyes flicked to Miguel, who flexed his fists eagerly. Camila stood nearby, her expression carefully neutral, though her sharp eyes followed every movement. Fine, Javier said, his voice calm despite the tension knotting in his chest. But I'll need some help. Diego arched a brow. Help? You're already making demands? Javier glanced at Miguel. You want this done right or not? Let him hold the guy down. I'll handle the rest. For a moment, Diego studied him, as if trying to decode his intentions. Then with a dismissive wave, he said, Do it. Miguel dragged the man, bound and terrified, from the steel door. Javier moved with deliberate slowness, retrieving the crowbar from the crate. He could feel Miguel's eyes boring into him, waiting for him to falter. As Javier approached the captive, he hesitated, feigning indecision. Miguel scoffed, stepping closer to grab the man by the shoulders and shove him to the floor. Do it already, Miguel barked. In that instant, Javier made his move. He swung the crowbar, not at the captive, but at the crate behind him, the noise loud enough to send a jolt through everyone in the room. The distraction worked. Miguel turned just slightly, and Javier capitalized, slipping the crowbar into the man's bound hands behind his back. He whispered quickly, Run when I say. Javier raised the crowbar again, pretending to aim at the man. You're lucky Diego wants you alive, he said loudly, delivering a staged blow to the ground beside him. When Miguel leaned in to mock the captive, Javier shouted, Now! The man scrambled to his feet, shoving Miguel off balance. In the chaos, Javier twisted free of his own restraints, grabbing a knife from the ground. He stood between the captive and the others, a calculated risk. Diego's laughter cut through the tension. Not bad, he said, amused by Javier's audacity. Maybe you do have some fight in you. But the suspicion in Diego's eyes lingered. Javier knew he had bought himself time, but the test had only deepened the gang leader's wariness. Javier leaned against the cold steel beam in the dim warehouse, pretending to rest while his mind worked tirelessly. The test had shaken the delicate balance, and Diego's growing distrust was palpable. Yet amid the tension, he noticed something else. Camilla's lingering glances, her quiet observations. She wasn't just a strategist, she was someone searching for an opportunity. Late that night, while the others dispersed to their corners of the hideout, Camilla approached. Her steps were measured, her expression a blend of curiosity and skepticism. You surprised Diego today, she said, her voice low but steady. Javier smirked faintly. Guess I'm full of surprises. Her lips twitched in the ghost of a smile before she quickly masked it. Don't let it go to your head. Diego doesn't forgive easily. Noted, Javier replied, his tone light. But it's not just him I need to watch out for, is it? Camilla crossed her arms, leaning against a nearby crate. What are you implying? Javier shrugged. You seem different from the others, smarter, less impulsive. I can't imagine you're satisfied with the way things are. Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't deny it. Careful, Javier. Words like that can get you killed. Only if the wrong person hears them, he countered. A tense silence followed, broken only by the faint hum of a generator somewhere in the building. Finally, Camilla sighed, her gaze drifting to the shadows. Diego wasn't always like this. There was a time when he cared about the gang, about the people in it. But power changes people. Now he only trusts himself, and that paranoia will destroy us all. Javier seized the moment, leaning in slightly. So why stay? Why let him drag you down with him? Camilla's eyes snapped back to his, filled with something between anger and resignation. It's not that simple. You don't just walk away from Diego. You either survive with him or die against him. You don't believe that, Javier said softly. You're too smart to be trapped here forever. She hesitated, the weight of his words hanging in the air. For a moment, she looked almost vulnerable, the mask of confidence slipping. Then, As if catching herself, she straightened and stepped back. "Don't think you know me, Javier," she warned, her voice firm again. "You might have passed the test, but you're still on thin ice. Watch your step." As she walked away, Javier couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. Manipulating her was part of the plan, but the more he learned about her, the harder it became to ignore her humanity. Later that night, as he lay on the cold warehouse floor, he replayed their conversation in his mind. Camila was a key piece of the puzzle, ambitious but disillusioned, loyal yet questioning. If he could convince her to turn against Diego, it might be his best chance at dismantling the gang from the inside. But with every word he spoke, Javier felt himself walking a fine line between his mission and something far more dangerous: understanding her. Javier observed the warehouse's shifting dynamics with meticulous care. Diego's paranoia was reaching a fever pitch, and the cracks in the gang's foundation were widening. Every interaction, every glance, felt like another move in a high-stakes chess game, and now it was time to push the pieces further into place. Camila had grown more responsive to Javier's subtle suggestions, though she remained cautious. Their late-night conversations had shifted from sharp exchanges to careful probing, both trying to feel out the other's motives. Meanwhile, Miguel was becoming a problem. His growing suspicions about Javier threatened to unravel everything. It was during one of Diego's absences that Javier made his next move. The gang was gathered around the main area of the warehouse, their chatter filling the air. Camila was sitting at a table, her fingers tapping against a notebook as she reviewed their latest shipments. Javier approached her, his posture casual, but his words precise. "I heard something interesting," he said, his voice low enough for only her to hear. Camila glanced up, her expression unreadable. "What now?" "Word is, Diego's been holding back information from you. Some shipment details that only he and Miguel know about." Her tapping stopped. "And why would he do that?" Javier leaned in slightly. "You tell me. Maybe he's testing your loyalty, or maybe he doesn't trust you as much as you think." Camila's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond immediately. Instead, she glanced toward Miguel, who was joking loudly with two other gang members by the crates. Javier could see the doubt flicker across her face. Later, he approached Miguel directly, ensuring others could overhear. "Hey, Miguel," Javier said, his tone deliberately casual. "What's the deal with Camila these days? She seems distracted." Miguel's eyes narrowed. "What are you getting at?" "Nothing. Just saying she's been spending a lot of time with Diego lately, talking about things the rest of us don't hear about. Makes you wonder." Miguel's expression darkened. "Camila doesn't make decisions. Diego does." "Of course," Javier replied, raising his hands in mock surrender. "I'm just saying, if I were you, I'd keep an eye out. You know how ambitious people can get." The seed was planted. Miguel's suspicious nature would do the rest. That night, Camila found Javier sitting alone in a corner of the warehouse. She sat beside him, her movements unusually hesitant. "You said Diego's hiding things," she began. "What do you know?" Javier met her gaze, his voice steady. "Enough to see the writing on the wall. He's isolating himself, pulling Miguel closer while keeping you at arm's length. If you want to survive, you'll need to act before it's too late." She looked away, her expression hardening. "And what about you? Why are you so eager to help me?" "Because I know what it's like to be stuck in a losing game," Javier admitted, letting a trace of vulnerability seep into his voice. "I've been where you are, and I don't think you deserve to go down with him." Camila didn't respond immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but firm. "If I do this, I need more than just words. I need proof." Javier nodded. "Then we'll get it." But as he made his silent promises, a new threat emerged. Miguel had been watching him, and the flicker of realization in his eyes told Javier that his cover was beginning to slip. The game was accelerating, and every move was more dangerous than the last. Miguel had never trusted Javier. From the moment the stranger had walked into their operation, something about him had felt wrong. His instincts, honed from years of watching his back, were rarely off. And now, the little things Javier said, the subtle ways he interacted with Camila, and the way Diego's suspicions lingered on him, all painted a clearer picture. Late one night, while the rest of the gang rested or kept watch, Miguel began piecing together his thoughts. He scoured the room where Javier's belongings had been tossed when he was first brought in. Among the tattered clothes and miscellaneous items, He found something that didn't belong, a slip of paper tucked into the lining of a boot. It wasn't much, a fragment of a contact number with a faint police insignia embossed on the corner. Miguel's blood ran cold. He stared at it for what felt like an eternity before shoving it into his pocket. The next morning, Miguel confronted Camila in the corner of the warehouse. "We need to talk," he said, his tone sharp. Camila, still half distracted by her plans with Javier, frowned. "About what?" "It's him," Miguel growled, jerking his head toward Javier, who was talking to another gang member across the room. "He's not who he says he is." Camila tensed, but her expression didn't give away much. "What are you talking about?" "I found this," Miguel said, producing the slip of paper. "You don't get something like this unless you're working with the cops. He's playing all of us." Camila took the paper, her eyes scanning it carefully. Her stomach churned, but she kept her voice calm. "And you think Diego will believe this? A scrap of paper? He barely trusts you as it is." Miguel's face darkened. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you need more than this," she replied smoothly, handing the paper back. "If you're wrong, Diego won't just kill him. He'll kill you for doubting his judgment." Miguel hesitated, her words clearly sinking in. Camila took a calculated risk, leaning in closer. "We both know Diego's on edge. He's been looking for a reason to cut someone loose. Do you really want to hand him an excuse?" Miguel gritted his teeth. "Then what do you suggest?" Camila sighed, feigning exasperation. "Watch him, follow him. If he slips up, then we act. But until then, keep this between us. No point in stirring the pot until we're sure." Miguel reluctantly nodded, though the distrust in his eyes lingered. Later that day, Camila found Javier in the shadows of the warehouse, her voice sharp as she whispered, "We have a problem." Javier's brow furrowed. "What kind of problem?" "Miguel knows," she said, cutting straight to the point. "He found something, a piece of evidence. He hasn't told Diego yet, but it's only a matter of time." Javier cursed under his breath, his mind racing. "Then we need to act before he does." "No," Camila said, her tone firm. "If you move too soon, Diego will know something's wrong. Let me handle Miguel. I can keep him in check for now." Javier hesitated but nodded. "Fine. But if he gets too close..." "I'll deal with it," she interrupted, her eyes flashing. As the day stretched on, the tension in the warehouse became suffocating. Miguel's gaze followed Javier wherever he went, his suspicion growing with every passing moment. But Camila, true to her word, kept him occupied with tasks and distractions, buying Javier precious time. When night fell, Miguel finally made his move, marching toward Diego with the slip of paper in hand. But before he could speak, Camila stepped in, her voice calm but commanding. "Diego, there's something you need to see." In a carefully orchestrated play, Camila revealed false evidence, a doctored message implicating Miguel as the traitor. Diego's fury erupted instantly, and before Miguel could defend himself, Diego's enforcers dragged him into the shadows. Javier watched from a distance as Miguel's cries were silenced, his heart heavy with the cost of survival. Another piece had been sacrificed, but the game was far from over. The warehouse buzzed with a strange, uneasy energy in the wake of Miguel's death. Diego had become more volatile, his paranoia creeping into every interaction. He barked orders at the remaining gang members, his temper flaring at the slightest misstep. The atmosphere was ripe for collapse, and Javier knew the time to strike was now. In the shadows of the warehouse, Javier and Camila finalized their plan. Every detail had to be perfect. Any mistake could cost them both their lives. "Diego's slipping," Camila murmured, her voice barely audible over the hum of the nearby generator. "He's isolated, paranoid. This is the moment." Javier nodded. "He's got his inner circle left. We take them out first, and Diego will have no one to turn to." Camila hesitated, her eyes lingering on Javier. "Are you sure about this? Once we start, there's no going back." Javier met her gaze, his voice steady. "There was no going back the moment I walked into this place." That night, the trap was set. Camila fed Diego a stream of false information about a rival gang moving in on their territory. The attack was staged, complete with gunshots and planted evidence of betrayal among Diego's men. Diego took the bait. As chaos erupted, he ordered his remaining enforcers to prepare for a counterstrike. What he didn't realize was that Javier and Camila were dismantling his support system from within. The first move came swiftly. One of Diego's trusted lieutenants fell in the confusion, taken out by Camila's well-placed blade. Another was lured into a blind spot where Javier waited, his strikes precise and brutal. The warehouse echoed with shouts and gunfire as the operation reached its climax. Diego, realizing he was cornered, retreated into his office, barricading himself inside. Javier and Camila followed, their steps deliberate as they approached the final confrontation. Inside, Diego was pacing like a caged animal, a pistol clenched tightly in his hand. His eyes darted between Javier and Camila as they entered, his voice rising in a mix of fury and desperation. "You think you can take me down?" Diego snarled. "After everything I built?" "This isn't about what you built," Javier said coldly. "It's about what you destroyed." Diego's gaze flickered to Camila. "And you? I trusted you." Camila stepped forward, her expression hardened. "You trusted no one, Diego. That's why we're here." The standoff was brief but intense. Diego raised his pistol, but Javier was faster. The shot rang out, and Diego staggered, collapsing into the desk behind him. The once feared leader of the gang lay motionless, the phoenix tattoo on his neck now a tragic irony. The silence that followed was deafening. Javier turned to Camila, who was clutching her side. Blood seeped through her fingers, staining her shirt. "You're hurt," Javier said, rushing to her side. "I'll live," she replied through gritted teeth, though her face was pale. Together, they stumbled out of the office. The warehouse was eerily quiet, the remnants of the gang either dead or fled. The empire Diego had built had crumbled in a single night. But as they stood among the wreckage, Javier couldn't shake the weight of what they had done. "Is it over?" Camila asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "For Diego, yes," Javier said. "But for us? Not yet." The dawn brought little relief. The warehouse stood silent and bloodied, the stench of gunpowder and death lingering in the air. Javier and Camila moved carefully, their steps slow as they navigated the wreckage. Every muscle in Javier's body ached, and his mind raced with the weight of what had just transpired. Camila leaned against a broken crate, pressing her hand harder against her side. The makeshift bandage Javier had applied was already soaked through. "You need a hospital," Javier said firmly, crouching beside her. "And risk being found?" she shot back, her voice weak but defiant. "We both know that's not an option." Javier hesitated, knowing she was right. But watching her pale, battered form stirred an uncomfortable mix of guilt and determination. He had promised himself he wouldn't cross certain lines, wouldn't let this mission destroy his humanity. Yet here they were, standing on the ruins of lives taken and trust broken. Camila's gaze fixed on him. "What happens now, Javier? What's your plan?" Javier looked away for a moment, his jaw tightening. "I have enough evidence to take down the rest of the operation. The suppliers, the money trails. It's all there." "And me?" she asked, her tone soft but piercing. He met her eyes, unsure of how to answer. "You should disappear. Start over somewhere far from this mess." Camila laughed bitterly, wincing as the movement jarred her injury. "Disappear? You think it's that easy? Diego's dead, but someone else will fill the void. That's how this works." "Not if we've dismantled everything," Javier said, though even he heard the doubt in his voice. Camila studied him for a long moment before shaking her head. "You're a good man, Javier, too good for this world, but that goodness, it's going to get you killed." He didn't respond, the weight of her words pressing down on him. As the sun rose higher, Javier helped Camila to her feet. They made their way out of the warehouse, the quiet city streets a stark contrast to the chaos they had left behind. At a safe distance, they stopped, Camila leaning heavily against him. "This is where we part ways," she said finally, her voice barely audible. Javier frowned. "Camila, don't," she interrupted. "We both know how this ends. You'll go back to your world, and I'll try to survive in mine." He wanted to argue, but the truth was undeniable. The gap between them was too wide, their choices too incompatible. Without another word, Camila turned and walked into the shadows of an alley, her figure soon swallowed by the city's maze. Javier stood there for a long time, his hands clenched at his sides. When he finally turned and walked away, it was with the haunting knowledge that the lines he swore never to cross had been blurred beyond recognition. Javier sat alone in the dimly lit precinct, the hum of fluorescent lights filling the silence. On the desk before him was a thick folder, its contents meticulously organized. Evidence, reports, and confessions, all pointing to the collapse of Diego's empire. It was a victory, or at least it was supposed to be. But as he stared at the papers, he felt no triumph, only the hollow ache of everything it had cost him. His superior, Captain Alvarez, entered the room, her expression a mix of relief and concern. "You did it, Roldan. With this, we can take down the rest of the network. The city owes you." Javier leaned back in the chair, his exhaustion evident. "The city doesn't owe me anything. I just did my job." Alvarez sat across from him, studying his face. "You've been undercover for months. Nobody comes out of something like that unscathed." Javier didn't respond immediately. His mind was elsewhere, back in the warehouse, replaying the gunfire, Diego's fall, and the look in Camilla's eyes as she walked away. "What happens to the people who filled the void?" he asked finally. Alvarez sighed, her fingers tapping lightly on the desk. "There's always someone waiting to step in, but with the evidence you brought, we'll cripple them before they get too far." The answer rang hollow. Javier nodded mechanically, pushing the folder toward her. "It's all there. Everything you need." As Alvarez took the folder, Javier stood, his movement slow and deliberate. "I need some air." She didn't stop him, but her gaze lingered as he walked out of the precinct and into the cool evening. The city was alive with its usual chaos. Sirens in the distance, honking cars, and the chatter of people who seemed blissfully unaware of the darkness beneath their feet. Javier wandered aimlessly, his thoughts heavy. He'd done what he set out to do. Diego El Fenix was gone, his gang dismantled, and justice, in its flawed way, had been served. But the victory felt tainted. The methods he'd used, the alliances he'd forged, and the lives he'd manipulated haunted him. He stopped at a small cafe, its neon sign flickering like a dying ember. Sitting at an outdoor table, he ordered a coffee and let the warmth of the cup ground him. It was a fleeting comfort. His phone buzzed on the table, breaking the silence. The message was from an unknown number. "It's done. Stay safe." Javier's chest tightened. He didn't need to guess who it was. Camilla had disappeared into the shadows, just as they'd planned. Whether she would resurface one day or truly start over was a question he might never have answered. As the hours passed, Javier's thoughts returned to his brother, the reason he had joined this mission in the first place. He had wanted to stop others from suffering the same fate, to make sure no one else lost a loved one to the drugs that Diego had flooded into the streets. Yet, standing on the other side of his mission, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had lost a part of himself in the process. The precinct called the next day. Alvarez informed him that raids were already underway, thanks to the evidence he had provided. Suppliers were being arrested, stash houses dismantled, and the remnants of Diego's operation were crumbling. "You should be proud," Alvarez told him. But pride wasn't what he felt. Weeks later, Javier returned to the warehouse, now abandoned and cordoned off by police tape. He stepped inside, the memories rushing back with startling clarity. The echo of footsteps, the sharp smell of metal and gunpowder, the oppressive weight of fear. It all lingered in the air like a ghost. Near the steel support beam where he'd once been chained, he found a small, folded note tucked under a loose brick. His hands trembled as he unfolded it, the handwriting instantly recognizable. "Survival isn't victory. Don't forget why you started this. See." Javier stood there for what felt like hours, the note crumpled in his hand. Camilla's words were a reminder and a warning, one he couldn't ignore. As he left the warehouse, he realized that his mission wasn't truly over. Diego's empire had fallen, but the void it left behind would inevitably pull others into its gravity. The fight against corruption, crime, and greed wasn't something that could be finished with one victory. Javier walked back into the city, his steps purposeful. He didn't know what came next, but he knew one thing. He wouldn't let the legacy of those he'd lost be consumed by the darkness. And somewhere in the maze of the city, Camilla was out there, carrying her own scars, her own version of the truth. Their paths might cross again, or they might not. But for now, Javier carried the weight of their shared story, determined to make sure it mattered. In the end, Javier's journey reminds us that the line between justice and vengeance can blur when emotions take control. He achieved his mission, but at what cost? The decisions he made weren't just about bringing down a gang, they were about confronting his own morality and how far he was willing to go for his beliefs. What would you have done in his place? Could you walk the fine line between right and wrong without losing yourself? Click the video on the screen to continue this journey of self-discovery and dive deeper into stories that challenge your values and decisions. Don't forget to subscribe for more captivating tales and moral dilemmas that will keep you thinking long after the credits roll. See you in the next story.